This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. In yesterday's session, we discussed how to develop web application by using Spring Boot. So as part of today's session also, we are going to understand how to develop our second web application by using Spring Boot. Right. So first, what is the procedure that we need to follow in order to develop our Spring Boot application, right? So the prerequisite to understand this class is MVC architecture. So we already uploaded a video to the YouTube. What is MVC architecture and how the request will be processed in the MVC based application. With that knowledge, so today we are going to build our application by using Spring Boot. Procedure to develop web application using Spring Boot. Procedure to develop web application using Spring Boot. So what is the first step? Create Spring Starter project. Create Spring Starter project in Spring Toolsuite IDE. You can use any IDE like IntelliJ or Toolsuite. Here I am using in Spring Toolsuite IDE. Create Spring Starter project in STS IDE. How to choose this starter project? In the Eclipse main menu, we have a file option. From the file option, we can use new file, new project, right? File, new project. From that, we can go for Spring Boot. In the Spring Boot, we have an option called Starter Project. Spring Starter Project, nothing but it is a Spring Boot application. So like this, we need to choose the option to create our boot application. At the time of creating the project, choose below dependencies. Choose below dependencies while creating project. While creating boot application. When we are creating application by using Spring Boot in the STS IDE, it will display option to choose version of the Spring Boot and it will display option to select the dependencies also. Right. In order to develop a web application by using Spring Boot with presentation technology, we need two dependencies. We need two dependencies. One is Spring Boot Starter Web. One is Spring Boot Starter Web. Second one is Tomcat Embed Jasper. Tomcat Embed Jasper. So these are the two dependencies that we need to select. These are the two dependencies that are required for our application development. So two dependencies we need to use for our application development. What are those two? One is Starter Web. Second one is Tomcat Embed Jasper. Right. Sir, what is the purpose of these two dependencies? What actually they are doing for our application? Right. Now, what they are doing is Boot Starter Web. Spring Boot Starter Web will provide below three things. Spring Boot Starter Web providing, this is a starter from providing below three functionalities for us. What are those three functionalities it is providing? Support to build MVC based application, support to build Spring, support to build web app based on Spring MVC, support to build web app based on Spring MVC, support to build REST API. It is providing support to build REST API, RESTful service. We can build RESTful service also by using this Boot Starter Web. It provides Tomcat as embedded container. It is providing Tomcat as a embedded container for us. So why I am selecting this Boot Starter Web dependency? Because of these three reasons. If you want to develop a web application based on the Spring MVC, you need this Boot Starter Web. If you want to develop a REST API by using our Boot application, then we need this Starter Web. And along with those two functionalities, it is providing one very important feature that is called embedded container will be available for us. What is that embedded container? By default, it is providing Tomcat as an embedded container. By default, it is providing Tomcat as an embedded container. That means you no need to set up a server separately to run our web application. When you go for Spring MVC, you need to run your project on the external server. You need to install the Tomcat, or you need to configure the Tomcat in the IDE to run it. But here, you no need to configure any server. Default, Boot is providing embedded container, which is Tomcat for us. Tomcat is providing as the embedded container. If you want, you can change from Tomcat to Jetty also. That we will see in the coming classes. But for the current application, I will go with Tomcat as the embedded container, which is providing by Spring Boot. Now, what is this Tomcat Embed Jasper? Tomcat Embed Jasper is used to compile and render our JSP files. It is used to render. It is used to compile. It is used to compile JSP files. It is used to compile our JSP files. If we don't have this, if we don't add it, view file will be downloaded instead of rendering. Instead of rendering that file will be downloaded in the browser. I don't want to download the views on the browser. I want to render views on the browser. To render that view on the browser in the boot web application, Tomcat Embed Jasper is required only for JSP. If you are using JSP as a presentation technology, then we need to use Tomcat Embed Jasper, which is used to compile our JSP files. What will happen if this is not available? If this file is not, if this dependency not available, your view, that is JSP that we are using as a view technology, that JSP file will be downloaded in the browser when you send a request. But actually end user don't want to download the JSPs. End user wants to see the content in the browser. So to display that content in the browser, we need to have this dependency in the build path. Are you able to follow this? Right. First, we need to create a starter project in the IDE. Starter project, nothing but a boot application. So boot application, boot can be used to build a standalone application. Boot can be used to build a web application. Default will be standalone. If you want to build web application by using boot, then we need to select this starter in the Spring Boot. What is the name of the starter? Spring Boot Starter Web, which will provide the support to develop web applications by using boot. Not only web application, it will provide the support to develop RESTful services also by using boot, and it is providing Tomcat as an embedded container. So if you run your application, that directly will be deployed to the Tomcat server. Right. Now, so what is the purpose of Tomcat Embed Jasper? It is used to compile the JSPs. If you don't add this dependency in your pom.xml, that JSP file will be downloaded whenever you send a request. I don't want to download the JSP. I want to render the JSP in the browser. Then we should add this dependency. Right, perfect. Now, after creating this project, now we are going to create Spring Controller class, create user-defined Spring Controller, create our controller, create user-defined Spring Controller class, create user-defined Spring Controller class, and write required methods. And bind controller methods to URL pattern. And bind controller methods to URL pattern. Write the controller class. Create Spring Controller class. Write methods. Write required methods in controller class, and bind those controller methods to URL patterns, because controllers are not we are going to execute in the project. These controllers are request handlers. These controllers are called as request handlers. So in order to handle the request sending by the end user, we are writing a method in the controller. So when that method should be executed, we need to bind the request URL pattern to controller method, right? We should create one user-defined Spring Controller class. In that controller class, we are going to write required methods in that class. Once we write those methods, we need to bind those methods to URL patterns, right? For that, we are going to use two annotations here. We are going to use two annotations here. What is the first annotation? The annotation is at controller to represent Java class as Spring controller. To represent one Java class as a Spring controller, we are using one annotation that is called at controller. At controller annotation is a stereotype annotation which is used to represent our Java class as a Spring controller. This at controller is a stereotype annotation to represent our Java class as a Spring controller. Now, next one. To bind our method to URL pattern, we will use the annotation called at request mapping to bind method to URL pattern. To bind method to URL pattern. So if you remember your servlet application development, every servlet we will bind to a URL pattern either in the web.xml file or by using at web servlet annotation, right? So every distributed component methods should be binded to URL pattern. Distributed component means we are not going to access in our project. That component will be accessed from outside of the project. That component will be accessed from outside of the project. Now, if you observe here in my project, I am writing one controller class. Inside the controller, there are several methods are available. M1 method, M2 method, M3 like this. For example, there are three methods are available. Now, there is one end user who want to access our method. This is our project. Inside our project, one controller class is available. In that controller class, three methods are available. There is one end user who want to access our application. Does this person can create the object for our controller and call the method? Come on. Can this person create the object and call our method? He is not from our project. He is an end user. First of all, he don't know what is software programming. He don't know what is Java. He don't know what is object. So then how can he access our controller method? How can he access our controller method? There should be one URL. There should be one URL for this person. I will tell, hey boss, you access my application like this, www.facebook.com. You access my application with this URL. Whenever you type this URL in the browser, whenever you send a request, that URL I will bind it to one method in my controller. That URL path I will bind to a method in my controller. Now I will tell one this. If you want to create an account in my Facebook application, you click on this register button. Now in the background, what I will do for this register button, I will write a URL pattern which is binded to this M2 method. Our component is a distributed component. This is accessing by others which are not part of our application. Now. Such kind of components are called as distributed components. Right. Servlet is one distributed component. Whenever I develop a servlet, do you think that I will create the object for the servlet to call the servlet method in our project? No. We will never create the object for the servlet. We will never call the servlet methods in our other classes. Servlet is meant for accessing by others who are from outside people. That means end users will access our servlet component. How end user is accessing our servlet component? By using URL pattern of that servlet. For login button, one URL pattern. For register button, one URL pattern. Every distributed component should be binded to URL pattern. Same thing here also. When I am writing methods in my controller class, other people, outside people are going to access my methods. How they can access my methods available in my controller? Do you think that this end user will create the object for my controller and will call the methods available in the controller? No, he cannot do that because he is not from our project. He is not part of our project. He is an end user. He don't know anything. Assume that he is a banking employee. He is a banking employee working in the bank, right? He want to use this Facebook. The bank employee from a accounts background, he don't know what is the programming language. He don't know how to create object for that class. He don't know how to call that method. Then how you are providing access for that user? That's where we need to bind our distributed components to URL patterns. Based on the URLs, even if that person don't know programming language, even that person don't know what is object, what is class, still he can access my component. So that is the reason every distributed component we will bind it to a URL pattern, that is HTTP URLs. HTTP methods we are going to use to bind our controller methods to URL patterns. Are you able to follow this? So the people who are going to access our applications, they don't know programming. Some of them don't know programming languages. They don't know how to create the object. So they cannot call our methods directly. That is the reason we should bind our distributed component to a URL pattern. Why are you binding your servlet to URL pattern? To provide the access for your component. Why are you binding your Spring MVC controller methods to URL pattern? To provide the access for our component. Similarly, in the Spring Boot also, we are creating a controller. In that controller, we are writing methods. How others can access our methods? That's where our method should be binded to a URL pattern. First of all, how to create a controller in our web application by using Spring Framework. To create the controller, we are having an annotation called add controller. This add controller is a stereotype annotation which is used to represent our Java class as a controller, and inside that controller we will write methods. That methods will be accessed by others. How others can access our methods? That's where URL patterns comes into picture. How to bind your method to a URL pattern? To bind the method to URL pattern, we are having an annotation called at request mapping. Right. Now, like this, we are going to write the controller and we are going to bind the methods to URL pattern. What is the return value of the controller? Controller methods are going to return model and view objects. Controller methods are going to return model and view objects. Sir, can I return directly response from the controller? Yes, there is possibility. We can use a response body directly. We can return the response data from the controller method, but for that we will discuss in the REST API. But currently I am going for web application with the presentation pair, right? So that's why I am going to return model and view object from the controller. Controller methods are going to return model and view object. In the MVC architecture, I explained what is that model and view. Model is used to store the data, or which is used to store the data. Model is something like a map. It is used to store data in the form of key and value pair. So you can store multiple key value pairs. That means we will store the data in the form of entry. One entry nothing but one key and one value. Model, it is used to store data in the form of key and value pair. Right. Next one, view represents logical view name. View represents logical view name. Only file name without extension. Only file name without extension. That means our controller also don't know what is the presentation technology we are using. Spring Framework is supporting for multiple presentation technologies. Controller classes in the Spring are independent of the presentation technology. Controllers are independent on the presentation technology. You can use whatever you want. There are some options are available. But currently I am going for JSP as a presentation technology, right? So what is the return value of the controller method? Controller method can return model and view object. Controller method can return directly response also. But here I am going for model and view object for this application. Controller methods are going to return model and view object. Model is used to store the data in the form of key and value pair. View, that represents a logical view name. Logical view name nothing but only name of the file without prefix and without suffix. Right. Now, once your controller method implementation is completed, then we need to create create view component, and access data available in model object using key. In the model object we are setting the data, right? That data we will set in the form of key value pair. Now where I need to display that data? I need to display that data in the view file. How can I access the data available in the model? Based on the key name, I'm going to access that value. Based on the key name, I'm going to access that value. Right. Now, next. After your view file creation is completed, now here I'm using JSP as a view file, right? So in that JSP, I will access the data by using model keys, which is used to display to the browser. After that is done, so now we need to do some minor configurations in application.properties file or application.yml file. Configure below details in application.properties file or application.yml, whatever we are using. Either we can use a properties file or we can use a YML file also. Configure below details in application.properties file or in application.yml file. What are the details we are going to configure? First thing, server embedded container port. What is the embedded container we are going to get by default? With the web starter, we are going to get Apache Tomcat. With the web starter, we are going to get Apache Tomcat as the embedded container. The Tomcat runs on 8080 port number, right? In my system, already Oracle service is running with the 8080. Tomcat cannot run with the 8080 because of this Oracle server. Two services cannot use the same port number. So that's why we need to change that port number in our properties file or in the YML file. And second one, view resolver configuration. View resolver. What is view resolver? View resolver is used to resolve view locations where the view files are available in the project. What is the presentation technology that will be identified by view resolver component in the Spring MVC? That also we need to configure in our properties file or in the YML file. Once this configuration is done, run Spring Boot application from main method. Run Spring Boot application from main method, that is available in start class. We have a start class for the Spring Boot, right? That start class we are going to execute, then it will start from the main method. Sir, this is a web application. Why main method is required? It is required for the Spring Boot. So Spring Boot applications are going to start from the main method only. Whether it is a standalone application or whether it is a web application, it is going to start from the main method. Once we run this boot application, access our controller method, test our application functionality. Whatever the development we have done, is it working as expected or not? We need to test that functionality. So how to test it? By sending a request to the controller method, we are going to test it. If we get the response in the browser as expected, then we can say our development is successful or our operation is successful, right? So these are the steps that we need to follow in order to develop web application by using Spring Boot. So before going to start this development, first go through the steps once again, understand that clearly, then I will develop this application. First step, we need to create starter project in the IDE. So these are the options that we need to follow, right? Next, at the time of creating the boot application, we need to add few dependencies which are required to develop and run our boot web application. What are those? One is boot starter web. This boot starter web will provide support to develop MVC based application. It provides the support to build REST API, and it will provide Tomcat as an embedded container to run our applications, right? Now, what is the purpose of this second dependency? Second dependency is used to compile the JSP files we are using in the project, because the JSP I am using as a presentation technology in this project, right? If I don't add this dependency, my JSP will not be rendered. My JSP will be downloaded in the browser. I don't want them to download. I want them to display the data in the browser. So I need to add this dependency. After this, we need to create controller class in the Spring application. First of all, what is controller? Controller is a request handler. Whatever the request sent by the end user, that will be handled by controller. So there are several ways are there to create controllers in the Spring MVC based application. So one of the recommended way is by using add controller annotation. So what is add controller? Add controller is a stereotype annotation which is used to represent our Java class as a Spring controller, right? Now, what is this request mapping? Request mapping annotation is used to bind our controller methods to URL patterns. Why to bind our controller methods to URL patterns? Our controllers are the distributed components which are going to access by end users. End users will not create the object to call this method. End user will send a HTTP request to access our method. So that HTTP request we need to bind it to a URL pattern, and that URL should be binded to our method. To bind our method to that URL pattern, we will use an annotation called request mapping, right? What you are going to return from the controller? Controller methods are going to return model and view object. What is that model? Model is used to store the data in the form of key and value pair. Whatever the data is stored in the model, that data you can access in the view by using key available in the model. Right. Now, what is that view? View is a component which is used to display response to the end user. In the controller, view is a logical view. Controller don't know what is presentation technology. Controller will return just name of the file, name of the view file, without prefix, without extension. Right. Now, once your controller method is completed, whatever the view it is returning, that view we need to create in our project, and we need to access the data available in the model by using keys, so that that value will be displayed to the browser using that view. Next, with this our coding part is done. With the fourth step, our coding part is done. What is fifth step? Configuration. Very minor configurations we are going to do. So now, if you have already developed the application by using Spring MVC, then you can imagine dispatch and servlet we need to configure, context loader listener we need to configure, servlet XML we need to configure, web.xml we need to configure, root application context we need to configure. Lot of things we need to do. We need to enable component scanning also. Lot of configurations we need to do in the Spring, plain Spring, legacy Spring framework. But this is the Spring Boot. It is an approach to develop the application with less configuration. Here I am not doing any component scanning enabling. I am not configuring anything in the web. First of all, web.xml itself is not available. Web.xml file is not available. I am not configuring any dispatcher servlet. I am not configuring any context loader listener. Nothing is required, because boot is going to take care of all those configurations. That is called auto configuration in the Spring Boot. What are the components that are required to run this application? Boot will understand, and boot will load those components. Boot will make those components are ready to run my application. That is the beauty of the Spring Boot. If I develop same application by using Spring framework, I need to do hell of configuration. Hell of XML files I need to create. Lot of configuration I need to do. But when I go for Spring Boot, I am not doing any configuration related to the XML files. The minor configurations that I am doing, one is port number change. This is also not mandatory in every system. If you don't have any application which is running on the 8080, then this step can be skipped. You don't need to configure that. By default, that is going to use 8080 as a port. Now, view resolver. This we need to configure to locate where the view files are available. So these are two things we need to configure in application.properties file or in the application.yml. With the fifth step, we are done. Now just we need to run our application. So to run our application, do I need to install the server, or I no need to install the server? We no need to install the server. The reason, boot supporting for embedded containers. So if you develop a web application If you add web starter in the pom.xml, boot will launch the server also for you. See the greatness of the Spring Boot. Just by adding one dependency, it is starting the server for you. It is getting the server for you. It is giving the server for you to run your application. It is going to start the server. It will deploy your application to the server also. That is the greatness of the Spring Boot. That is the beauty of the Spring Boot. So this is the reason this much demand is there for Spring Boot in the market. Why? Every company is asking Spring Boot, Spring Boot, Spring Boot. The reason, there are several advantages. It is a new methodology to develop Spring applications with minimal or less configuration. That is the reason every company is asking for Spring Boot developers, right? So rapid development we can do by using Spring Boot. We no need to do any configuration because the configuration part will be taken care by Spring Boot only, right? Nowadays, if you don't know Spring Boot, you will not survive in the IT industry as a Java developer. You will not exist in the IT industry as a Java developer if you don't know how to work with a Spring Boot, right? Spring is almost outdated in the market. It is almost dead. Nobody is using Spring framework directly to develop the application. People are using Spring Boot to develop the Spring based applications, right? Now, once this part is done, then we need to run our boot applications from main method. Sir, in the servlets, when we learn servlets, main method is not required. Yes, for servlets, main method is not required. Even for plain Spring, that main method is not required. But for Spring Boot, main method is required. Spring Boot application execution will start from main method only. After starting our application, server also will start by default. Boot will take care of that. Then we need to test our application. We need to test our application to check whether our application is working as expected or not. I hope all of you clear with the development procedure to develop our boot web application, right? Web application by using Spring Boot, right? Just go through this. Done. Now let me start this development. Fine. I open my toolsuite IDE, file, new project. Here there are several options are available. I'm going to choose the option as Spring Boot Starter. That is a Spring Starter project. It represents Spring Boot. Spring Boot web application. Spring Boot web application. If you observe, build tool I am using as Maven. Packaging type I am using as var. Java version I am using 8. Language I am using Java. And base package name I am giving as com.ashok.it. Click on next. Here we have options to choose version of the Spring Boot and available dependencies also. Current stable version of the Spring Boot 2.3.0. I'm choosing that. By default it is populating the 2.3.0 in the drop down. Available dependencies, search for them, right? Search for the dependencies. What dependency we need? Two dependencies we need. One is boot starter web, second one is Tomcat embed Jasper, right? When you type as the web, it will give Spring web option, right? Now I need to select it. See here what we are getting with this web. Build web including REST applications using Spring MVC. Generally people will ask, sir, what is the difference between Spring MVC and Spring Boot? Actually we should not compare them. Spring Boot also will use Spring MVC when you are developing a web application, right? And it is providing the support to build web and REST applications using Spring MVC, and it is using Tomcat as the default embedded container. Those three functionalities will be providing by this Spring Web. Select this dependency, right? Let us search for Tomcat. Tomcat. Now we are not getting that Jasper. Embed Jasper we are not getting from here. We'll get it from MVN repository. Embedded Jasper is not available. We'll get it from mvnrepository.com. No problem. right? So here I selected one dependency which is called Spring Web. Click on next, click on finish. Now our project is getting created. Spring Boot web application is getting created. Now I need one dependency which I am not able to find in our toolsuit IDE options, right? What is that? Tomcat embed Jasper. Go to MVN Central Repository. Go to mvncentralrepository.com. mvnrepository.com. There we can search for the dependencies. This is Maven Central Repository. Loading. Meanwhile, project is also getting created. Yes, now we are able to open mvnrepository.com. There type Tomcat embed Jasper, click on search. It will provide you dependency details. Just we need to copy those details and paste into our form.xml file. Give one moment, it is taking some time, net issue. Yes, we got the results for that. Search Tomcat embed Jasper, first one. Click on this. Now here we have options. Several options are there for Tomcat embed Jasper. We can take this any option. I'm taking 9.0.3.6. Just copy this. Version number we no need to configure because boot parent starter will take care of the version number. Just go to our form.xml file. Form.xml, right? By default, we got this starter web as we selected. With the starter web, we are getting Tomcat also, and test is coming by default. Now here I am adding that Tomcat embed Jasper. So I hope you remember what is the purpose of this Tomcat embed Jasper. It is used to compile our JSPs. I removed version number, no need to configure this because boot is going to take care of that version. Just to group ID, artifact ID I added. Group ID org.apache.tomcat.embed, artifact ID tomcat-embed-jasper. Perfect. With this, our project creation got completed and adding the dependencies also completed. Now what is the next step? What is the next step? We need to create controller. How to create a controller? Using at controller annotation. In that we will write a method. How to bind method to URL pattern? Using request mapping annotation. Let us do that. I am closing this form.xml. Go to Java resources, src main Java. By default, this boot application class got created. Right click on this src main Java, create one new class. I will create this class in a separate package. com.ashokit.controllers. com.ashokit.controllers. Name. I'm going to create this one as welcome controller. Create this as a welcome controller. Click on finish. Right. Now one Java class is created. It is a normal Java class now. To represent this Java class as a Spring controller, I need to use one stereotype annotation which is called @controller. This is predefined annotation available in Spring MVC to represent our Java class as a Spring controller. I'm importing that package. @controller. Now this is a stereotype annotation to represent our Java class as Spring controller. Perfect. Next, write a method public model and view, public model and view display welcome message. Display welcome message. So what is the return type of this? Model and view object. What controller will return? Model and view. So just I am creating model and view object. Model and view object. Then I am going to return that model and view object. I am returning that model and view object. Right. Now here I need to implement the logic. What data I want to send from this controller and where the data should be displayed. Right. Set that data. Model and view object dot add object key comma value. Key comma value. Key I am using as message. Value I am giving as welcome to Ashok IT. Right. So whatever the data that you want to send to the browser, add that data to the model object in the form of key and value pair. In the form of key and value pair. Fine. This is called one entry. Key and value. I stored the data to the model object. But now the question is, where the data should be displayed? That data should be displayed in a view file. In which view file that it has to be displayed? Set the name of the view. MAV dot set to view name. Set view name. I'm taking this as a index. I'm taking this as a index. That means the view file name is index. Index is a HTML, or index is a JSP, or index is a timely, or index is a velocity or free marker. Controller don't know. Controller is independent of the presentation technology. Controller just sending what data should be displayed, in which view file the data should be displayed. But what is that view? Controller don't know. What is that view? Controller don't know. Right. If anybody want to get the welcome message, now they need to call my method. Now assume that end user scenario. Can end user call my method now? Can end user call my method now? End user cannot call it because he cannot create the object for this class. He cannot call that method. Then what I need to do? I need to bind my method to a URL pattern. If I give that URL to end user, then he can access my distributed component by using that URL. So for every distributed component, URL patterns are mandatory. Otherwise, people cannot access our components. Right. Now, so here I will bind my method to a URL pattern. What is the annotation? That is @request mapping /welcome /welcome. Right. I binded this method to URL pattern called /welcome. Now anybody who want to access my component, now they can use this URL pattern called /welcome. Perfect. Now next step, controller method completed. Controller, we created a controller. We have written a method in the controller. We binded that method to URL pattern also, and the controller method is returning model and view object. Model is holding the data in the form of key and value, and it is returning a view name. That means this key you can access in this view. But what is the view file? Let us create it. Now if you observe the project folder structure, inside the SRC main, there is a folder called web app. There we need to write our resources. Inside the web app, I am going to write my view components. Right now, for the view components, here I will give one folder. Right click on the web app, new folder. I can give it as a pages, anything, any name you can give, or I will give it as a views folder name. You can give any name for that folder. Right now, views folder got created inside the web app. Guys, in the normal Spring application, WebINF will be available. In the boot, WebINF is optional. WebINF will not come by default. So inside the project, if you expand the SRC, inside the SRC main folder, inside the main folder, web app folder. Inside the web app folder, I created views folder. Inside the views, I will create my view file. What should be name of the view? Index. That is returning by my controller. So right click on the views, new JSP. I am using JSP as a presentation technology. So let me write it as index.jsp. Click on next, click on finish. With this, JSP file is created. Now, I want to access the data from the model. I want to print that model data on the browser as a heading. Right? How to access the data from the model based on the expression language by using $of message. Dollar is representing expression language here. Message is the key that is available in the model. Message is the key that is available in the model. Whenever you access that key, it is going to give you value which is associated in that. Value which is associated for that key. It is something like map.get of key to get the value of that particular key. $of message. So message is the key which is holding this value. So that value we are going to get by using $of message. We are going to get that value by using this key. We are going to get that value by using this key called message. So now with this we understood what is the view component that we need to develop and what is the name. Can I change the name to something? If I change my view file name, then I need to change this set view name in the controller. My controller is setting the view name as an index. So my view file name should be as a index only. Does my controller know whether my view is a JSP or my view is a time leaf? My controller don't know. Controller is just giving a logical view name. Controller is giving just logical view name. Right. So I hope you got how to create the view and how to access the data in the view using model keys. $of key. Then it is going to give you value which is associated to that key. Right. Now what is the next step? Once your controller method is completed, once your view component is completed, then what is the next step that we need to follow? Fifth step we need to complete now. What is the purpose of the fifth step? Fifth step is used to change the port number of the embedded container and configuring view resolver. Why I need to change the port number? Default container of that is Tomcat is running on the port number called 8080. Now I'm going to change that port number to some different value. Right. Where I need to configure this? Those things I need to configure in application and properties file, or I need to configure in application.yml file. Got it? Right. Fine. Now let us go to our project resources folder. Inside the Java resources folder, main Java is available, main resources available. If you expand the main resources, there you can see a file called application and properties. You can rename it to YAML also, no problem. Right. Go for application.properties. Now I want to change the port number. So what is the key for that? Server.port. If you don't remember, just use control space. Shortcut is going to work here. Server.port is equal to 8082. The default port is 8080. Now I am changing to 8082. Now configuring embedded container port. It is optional. By default, it will come with 8080. Next, configure view resolver. View resolver configuration. For the view resolver, we need to set two values. One is called prefix, another one is called suffix. Spring dot, that is key, spring dot MVC dot view. If you don't remember this key, just type as view and type control space. Then you will get MVC prefix, MVC view prefix, MVC view suffix. Right. What is prefix? Where the views are available inside the web app views folder. So I'm configuring this as my byte up to web app is a context path. You don't need to specify that. But views we need to specify. This is the location where the view components are available. Right. Now configure the suffix also. Spring dot MVC dot view dot suffix. It represents extension of the view. It is representing extension of the view. Perfect. With this we are able to complete our fifth step also. Configure the port number, change it the port number and configure view resolver. Perfect. Next step. Run our boot application from the main method. Right. You can directly run that application by right clicking on the project, run as Spring Boot. Now it will scan for main method and it is going to start from that. Or else we will go to the start class. We'll go to the start class and we'll right click on this class, run as boot app. Now observe the console. Right, with this our application got started. Just read these console messages once. What happened in the application? Just read these messages once. Right. So if you observe these console messages, you can see no profiles are activated. Starting Tomcat, initialized with the port number 8082. Root web application context also started. Tomcat started on the port number 8082. Finally, application also started on the port number 8082. Right. Now, I want to access that controller component. I want to access our controller component. So here we need to remember one thing. Note, by default, Spring Boot will not consider, project name in context path. By default, Spring Boot will not consider project name in context path. Now, so how I need to access my application? The URL, right? What is the URL I need to write? http://localhost : what is the port number? Localhost nothing but IP address of the server. Server IP. I need to specify. Then I need to specify server port. After that, URL pattern, resource URL directly. Resource URL. I don't need to specify project name, right? So server IP is what? Now let me frame this URL according to our component. Right. http:// server is running in the same machine, so I can use localhost for that. Port number, I change it to 8082 slash what is the resource URL slash welcome. This is the URL pattern that I need to use to access my component. Why project name we are not specifying in the URL? Boot will not consider the project name because it is using a embedded container. It is not going to use that project name in the URL. Right. Now, can I test my component by using this URL? Yes, I hope you understood what is the purpose of this URL. Slash welcome is a method URL pattern. This is the resource URL. 8082 is the embedded container port number. Localhost is the IP where my server is running. Right. Now, let us use this URL. Go to browser. One second. Yes. Let's type this URL. Click on enter. We are able to get our message as welcome to Ashokite. So whatever the method we are writing in the controller, we are able to access that method. Whatever the method we are writing, we are able to access that method by using that URL pattern. Right. Similarly, can I write one more method in the same controller? Something like a multi-action controller. One controller can perform multiple actions also. Can I write a one more method in this controller? Right. Let me write a one more method. Public model and view display greet message. Public model and view display greet message. So what is the return type? I am taking the return type as model and view object. Model and view is equal to new model and view. I need to set the data. Model and view dot add object. Key I am giving as a message. Comma, value I am giving as some good morning. Right. Model and view is equal to new model and view object I'm creating. For that I'm adding the data in the form of key and value pair. Right. Now here I'm going to specify model and view dot set view name. Set view name. Now view name I am using same, that is index. Same view file I am using for two actions because in the view whatever the key I am accessing is same. So this method also is returning the same view with the key as a message. Right. Finally return MAV. Finally return MAV. Right. So this display welcome message method is returning the same view, and the display greet message method is returning the same view. Now end users can access this method or end users cannot access this method. Please confirm. End user can access that method or end user cannot access that method. End user cannot access that method. The reason is it is a normal Java method. It is not binded to the URL pattern. How can I bind that method to URL pattern? To bind that method to URL pattern, I need to use the annotation called request mapping. Make sure the URL patterns are unique. I cannot write same welcome here because welcome is already used by one method. It is already binded to one method. So we need to bind this method to different URL pattern. I'm giving as a greet. I'm giving this URL pattern as a greet. Right now. So can I call this controller as a multi-action controller now? Can I call this controller as a multi-action controller? I cannot call as a multi-action controller. Come on, respond. We can call, no, we can't call. We can call it as a multi-action controller because it is doing two actions. One is welcome action, another one is a greet action. So two actions are there. So we can call this as a multi-action controller. Right. Inside one controller, we can write multiple methods. Those methods should be binded to different URL patterns. All right. Now, do I need to create the index once again or existing index is going to sufficient? No need to create it. Already that file is created. Already that file is created, it is going to use. I don't need to do any change. Just stop our application and start once again. As of now, I did not tell you what is the dev tools. If I add the dev tools, no need to restart. It will take care of that. Now currently dev tools are not there, so I'm stopping this. Stopping the project. Now there are two URL patterns are available. For welcome message, this is the URL pattern. For greet message, we are having http://localhost:8082/greet. So we are having one controller. In that controller, we are having two methods. One method is binded to /welcome, another method is binded to greet. Response should be different. When I access welcome, it should display welcome to Ashok IT. When I access greet URL, it should display good morning. Let's check it. Is it working as expected or not? First, see the console as application started. Application started. Is it running? No, it stopped. Now let me start this application. Run as boot app. Run as boot app. Right. See the console. Same. Application started with a Tomcat. Port number it is considering as 8082 because we configured the port number as 8082. Perfect. Clear this console. Now my console is empty. Let me send the request once again. First, I'm sending request to welcome URL pattern. I'm sending the request to /welcome. So our method should be executed from the controller. When I send the request for welcome, it is giving the response as a welcome to Ashok IT. That view file is rendering on the browser. Now let me change this to /greet. Let me change the request URL pattern to /greet. Send request. Now I am getting the response as a good morning. So if I send the request to first URL pattern, it is giving a welcome message. If I send the request to the second URL pattern, it is giving the greet message. Right. So here if you observe, two windows I am opening in the browser. First one is sending a request to greet. Refresh. Now I am getting the response as good morning. Second one I am sending request to Welcome. I'm getting welcome to Ashokite. So there are two methods available in the controller. Those two methods are binded to two different URL patterns. Those are binded to two different URL patterns. Both are by returning the same view name. Both are returning the model data in the form of same key. Now see here, initializing Spring Dispatcher Servlet, completed initialization in 13 milliseconds. So whenever you send the request for the Spring Boot web application, Dispatcher Servlet will be initialized by default. Because to run our Spring web application, Dispatcher Servlet is required as a front controller. So if you go for normal Spring MVC with the Spring legacy framework, you need to configure the Dispatcher Servlet as a front controller. But when it comes to the Spring Boot, Boot is intelligent. Boot understands that for this web application, Dispatcher Servlet is required. That's why when we send the request, the Dispatcher Servlet got initialized by default. So we no need to configure this Dispatcher Servlet manually in the Boot web application. So as the Dispatcher Servlet is configured, it is executing our request. It is processing our request. What is Dispatcher Servlet? It is a front controller which is a predefined servlet in the Spring class. In the Spring framework. Dispatcher Servlet will talk to handler mapper as we discussed in the architecture. Handler mapper will be available, controller will be available, view resolver will be available, view component will be available. Let me open the diagram once that we discussed in the architecture session. Spring MVC flow. I'm opening this MVC architecture diagram that we discussed in the architecture session. So what is Dispatcher Servlet? Dispatcher Servlet is a front controller. Who is initializing the Dispatcher Servlet in the Boot application? Boot is initializing the Dispatcher Servlet. It is a predefined class. Right. Now, whenever I send this request, who is receiving that request? Dispatcher Servlet is receiving that request. Then what Dispatcher Servlet will do? It is talking to handler mapper. Hey dispatcher, I got a URL like this. I got a request like this. This is the resource URL. Could you please check in which controller there is a method binded to this URL? Then handler mapper is going to do that scanning. Handler mapper identified in the welcome controller there is a method which is binded to this URL pattern. So this class name, this method name, those details will be given to Dispatcher Servlet. Who will give that? Who will give that? Handler mapper will give. Go to a dispatcher. This URL pattern is binded to welcome controller class method. That information will be given to dispatcher. Then dispatcher will go to controller. Now it will come to this controller. It will call this controller method. What this controller method is doing? It is executing some logic and it is returning the data in the form of model and view. In the model, we are setting the data in the form of key and value pair, and view, logical view name we are returning. So this key we can access in this view to get this value, right? Model and view we are returning from this controller method, right? Fine. Once that controller is written this model and view object, dispatcher know the data, model data. Dispatcher know the view file, but where that view file is available, dispatcher don't know. So that's why this Dispatcher Servlet will go to this view resolver with that view name. It will give the view name to view resolver. Then what this view resolver will do? It will apply one formula, prefix plus view name plus suffix. Prefix plus view name plus suffix. It will apply this formula and it will return the data back to Dispatcher Servlet. What is prefix? The location where the view files are available. What is the suffix? The extension of that file. It is the extension of the file. Right. Prefix plus view name plus suffix. Now, where we configure that? In the properties file, we configure the view resolver. Prefix I gave as a slash views. Suffix I gave as a .jsp. Now, if you apply this formula, what will happen now? Views plus view name plus .jsp. Finally, our view file will be prepared. View location will be resolved. It will become views plus index plus .jsp. Views plus index plus .jsp. This will be done by view resolver. This will be done by view resolver. and it will give that data back to the dispatcher servlet. Give the data back to dispatcher servlet. Then what the dispatch servlet will do? It got the view name and it got the model data. Then it will give that view name and model data to the view component that is going to render that model data on that view. It will send that to the dispatcher. Then dispatcher will send that as a response to the end user. So this is how a request will be processed in the Spring MVC. Request will be processed in the Spring MVC. I hope with this you understood how to develop our web application by using Spring Boot and what are the minimal configurations that we need to do to run our boot applications. Right. Thank you.